The morning air over the Pacific was strangely quiet. The last echoes of engine roar faded into the distance as pilots climbed down from their aircraft, their faces streaked with sweat and triumph. On the flight deck of Akagi, heat shimmered off the metal, carrying the heavy scent of fuel and salt. The men around him laughed, embraced, and celebrated what seemed like an unquestionable victory at Pearl Harbor. A blow so devastating that even the most optimistic planners had not dared imagine it. But Commander Minoru Genda did not celebrate. He looked toward the horizon, where the rising sun cast long shadows across the sea, and felt something colder than the December wind. Beneath the noise of victory, he could already hear the quiet truth. The numbers did not lie. The fuel that burned in every returning aircraft, the oil that surged through every warship engine, those numbers told a story no bomb could erase. Had Japan truly struck a decisive blow, or had it simply lit the first fuse of a war it could never afford to fight? The answer, he knew, waited in the mathematics no one wanted to confront. The road to Pearl Harbor did not begin on the morning of December 7th. It began years earlier in boardrooms, ministries, and quiet naval offices where charts of oil reserves lay open beside maps of the Pacific. Japan's leaders understood that their empire, vast as it looked, on paper, ran on fuel they did not possess. Nearly 90% of the oil that powered their ships, aircraft, factories, and cities came from foreign shores, mostly from the United States and the Dutch East Indies. Every battleship sortie, every training flight, every convoy escort consumed a resource Japan could not replace. By the summer of 1941, the situation turned critical. After Japan pushed deeper into Southeast Asia, the United States responded with a full embargo on oil shipments. Britain and the Dutch government in exile quickly followed. For the first time in modern history, Japan faced a future without the lifeblood of its military power. In Tokyo, anxiety mixed with calculation. A nation that had built its identity on expansion now confronted a choice that would determine the fate of millions. Inside the Naval General Staff, planners like Captain Kamei Kurushima worked through the numbers with a quiet intensity. He knew the cruising range of every American and Japanese warship by memory. He knew how much fuel a destroyer burned at 15 knots, and how that figure tripled when combat required maximum speed. He knew Japan's reserves, 50 million barrels, looked impressive only until measured against real wartime consumption. At peacetime rates, the Imperial Navy alone burned through nearly half of that each year. At wartime tempo, the reserves would evaporate long before victory could be secured. Yet, the strategic assumptions guiding Japan pointed toward war. The first assumption was that the war would be short, a lightning campaign that would shock the United States into negotiation within 6 to 8 months. The second assumed that the Imperial Navy would fight according to its cherished doctrine of a decisive fleet battle near Japan, minimizing fuel consumption. The third relied on the belief that capturing the oil fields of Borneo, Sumatra, and Java would instantly replenish the empire's supplies. These assumptions were comforting and dangerously flawed. Still, momentum carried Japan forward. Admirals debated, ministers hesitated, but the arithmetic remained unchanged. If Japan did not fight, it would slowly suffocate under the embargo. If it did fight, the empire would gamble everything on speed, precision, and the hope that America lacked the will to sustain a long war. From these pressures, the Pearl Harbor Plan emerged. A bold attempt to buy time, cripple the Pacific Fleet and secure a perimeter in Southeast Asia before oil reserves ran dry. Yet, even in those early days, some officers sensed the truth. They understood that oil, not warships, would decide the conflict. And as the fleet steamed toward Hawaii under radio silence, those calculations weighed heavily, silently foreshadowing the collapse that would follow. The first months of the Pacific War seemed to confirm every hope Japanese planners had carried into 1941. From the jungles of Malaya to the waters of Luzon, Japanese forces advanced with a speed that stunned the world. Carrier groups struck with precision. Army units drove deep into British and American positions. And as the Empire swept through the Dutch East Indies, the long-coveted oil fields fell under Japanese control. For a moment, the war looked winnable, at least on the surface. But beneath the headlines of victory, the fuel gauges told a darker truth. Modern naval warfare was not the kind of conflict Japan had prepared for. The Imperial Navy's strategy had been shaped by earlier eras, when fleets maneuvered slowly toward a single decisive engagement. Now, in 1942, the battlefield spanned thousands of miles. Carrier task forces raided enemy bases across entire oceans. Submarines prowled distant shipping lanes. Destroyers raced back and forth, escorting convoys and responding to sudden crises. The war had become a contest of movement, and movement devoured fuel. A destroyer cruising peacefully at 15 knots consumed roughly 100 tons of oil per day. In combat operations pushing 25 to 30 knots, it burned 3 to 4 times as much. And combat operations were no longer rare moments. They were the new normal. Ships deployed for weeks at a time, covering distances Japanese planners had not imagined when they made their fuel projections. Every unexpected encounter, every emergency maneuver, every high-speed chase drained fuel that Japan could not afford to lose. Even as Japanese forces captured the oil fields in Borneo, Sumatra, and Java, they discovered a harsh reality. Possession did not equal production. The Dutch and British defenders had executed a scorched earth retreat, sabotaging wells, destroying pumps, rupturing pipelines, and crippling refineries. Some facilities appeared intact from the outside but were quietly ruined, wiring cut, seals damaged, essential components discarded or buried. The destruction was systematic, deliberate, and effective. Japan lacked the petroleum engineering expertise to repair the damage quickly. Their domestic industry was tiny, their pool of trained engineers even smaller. Many captured Dutch specialists were interned rather than employed due to fears of sabotage. Equipment shortages compounded the crisis. Every drilling rig or refinery component had to be shipped from Japan on merchant vessels, already straining under wartime demands. And even when production resumed, it did so at a fraction of pre-war capacity. In 1942, the oil fields of the Dutch East Indies produced only 9 million barrels, barely 40% of their peacetime output. The empire needed more than twice that amount to sustain its ambitions. By the time the Japanese High Command realized the full scope of the crisis, their early victories had become a trap. Every mile gained in the Pacific stretched their supply lines further. Every new front demanded more fuel. The short war they had counted on was slipping away, replaced by a grinding struggle Japan was never built to endure. By late 1942, the first signs of collapse were no longer subtle. The Imperial Navy's fuel reserves, once projected to last years, were shrinking at a rate that stunned even the most pessimistic officers. What began as a manageable shortage soon revealed itself as a structural crisis. Production in the Dutch East Indies could not keep pace. Shipyards could not build tankers fast enough. And above all, American submarines had found Japan's Achilles heel. The submarine war was not flashy. There were no great battles, no sweeping formations of aircraft overhead. Only the quiet, deadly work of steel hunters lying in wait along Japan's supply routes. The Luzon Strait became a graveyard for tankers. Each sinking was more than a loss of tonnage. It was a rupture in Japan's economic bloodstream. A single tanker might carry 75,000 barrels of oil, enough to fuel destroyer operations for weeks. When it vanished beneath the waves, that fuel vanished with it. Oil sat useless in storage tanks in Borneo and Sumatra, with no ships left to carry it home. Those tankers that survived sailed under constant fear. Crews zigzagged across the ocean, detouring along coastlines, hiding in shallow bays. Routes that once took 4 weeks stretched to 5 or 6. Every extra day burned the fuel and reduced the number of annual voyages. Even without the torpedoes, the submarine campaign was eroding Japan's logistics through psychology and delay. Desperation pushed the Imperial Navy toward drastic solutions. Some proposed reducing fleet operations, keeping ships idle to conserve fuel. But doing so meant surrendering the initiative to the Americans. Others suggested basing the fleet near the oil fields in Singapore or the Dutch East Indies, closer to fuel, but thousands of miles from the battles that mattered. And in a move born from necessity, ships increasingly burned unrefined crude oil. The effect was immediate and brutal. Boilers fouled, maintenance cycles shortened, failures multiplied. Every attempt to stretch the fuel supply came with a cost the fleet could not afford. By mid-1944, the consequences were undeniable. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, Japanese carriers entered combat at the edge of their operational range, unable to maneuver freely for fear of burning irreplaceable fuel. Their aircraft were launched into what would be remembered as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, but the ships beneath them were already doomed by the math that stalked every mile they traveled. Months later, at Leyte Gulf, Japan committed its remaining strength in a last, desperate sortie. The operation consumed a staggering portion of the empire's dwindling reserves. When the surviving ships limped home, some barely afloat, fleet commanders faced a grim truth. There would be no more large-scale operations. The tanks were dry. And then came April 1945. The battleship Yamato, pride of the Imperial Navy, was ordered to sail on a mission designed with no return path. With barely enough fuel to reach Okinawa, she would beach herself and die as a stationary fortress. It was not simply a tactical decision. It was the final acknowledgement that Japan's war had been lost long before its greatest ship met its end. The tragedy of Yamato was not its sinking, but the stark reality it revealed. A navy that once ruled the Western Pacific had been reduced to a fleet of immobile giants, trapped by empty fuel tanks and the arithmetic no one could escape. For the United States, the attack on Pearl Harbor did not trigger hesitation or fracture. It forged unity. Within hours of President Franklin Roosevelt's address declaring December 7th, a date which will live in infamy, the American public, Congress, and industry aligned with a clarity Japan had never expected. What Japanese planners assumed would break American resolve instead ignited one of the greatest industrial mobilizations in human history. Factories that once built cars began turning out tanks, aircraft, and engines. Shipyards produced new carriers and the Liberty ships at a pace the world had never witnessed. Most importantly, the United States expanded a logistics network on a scale Japan could not imagine. Fleets of oilers, convoys, repair ships, and a constant flow of tankers that made American naval operations effectively limitless. Fuel, once merely an asset, became a strategic weapon. American submarines became the sharp edge of this logistical warfare. Guided by intelligence breakthroughs and supported by a constant stream of new boats, they hunted Japan's merchant fleet with uncompromising focus. Unlike surface battles, this campaign unfolded quietly, ship by ship, tanker by tanker, until Japan's entire maritime lifeline began to unravel. Each submarine patrol chipped away at the foundation of Japan's war effort, reducing its ability to move oil, troops, equipment, and even food. The submarine force, which made up less than 2% of the U.S. Navy, would ultimately sink over half of Japan's merchant fleet. Across the world, the geopolitical shock waves of Japan's expansion accelerated. Britain and the Dutch government in exile doubled down on embargoes and sabotaged oil infrastructure during their retreats. Australia and China aligned more deeply with U.S. strategy. The conflict was no longer a regional contest, but a global confrontation of resources, industrial strength, and political will. Japan had hoped that boldness would compensate for scarcity. The United States demonstrated that resilience, industry, and logistics would decide the fate of nations. While Japanese forces fought with courage and tactical sophistication, they faced an opponent able to replace losses faster than they could inflict them, and able to project power across oceans without ever worrying about the fuel required to get there. The imbalance was not only material, it was structural. And once the global system aligned against Japan, the outcome became a matter of time. In the final years of the war, as the Pacific burned from Okinawa to the Philippines, the truth that Minoru Genda sensed on the deck of Akagi returned with unmistakable clarity. Japan had never lost the war in a single battle. It had lost it in the quiet arithmetic of oil fields, tanker routes, and industrial capacity long before the first aircraft ever took a flight over Pearl Harbor. The story was not one of courage failing, but of numbers prevailing. Throughout history, nations have celebrated their heroes, their ships, and their victories. But the Pacific War reminds us that triumph and tragedy often begin in places far from the battlefield, boardrooms, planning tables, supply depots, and factories. Japan's planners had hoped that skill, discipline, and daring could bend reality to their will. Yet war, at its core, respects no ambition that ignores basic resources. 40 million barrels were required. 25 million barrels were available. The gap between those two figures was the true battlefield, and it was one Japan could never cross. As the war drew to its close, the symbolic moments felt almost poetic. Giants like Yamato, once the pride of an empire, sat at anchor, without the fuel to move. Entire fleets remained idle, while American forces, supported by endless tankers and global supply lines, advanced island by island. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the outcome had already been written in the shortages of 1942, the sinking tankers of 1943, and the empty fuel bunkers of 1944. Yet, the legacy of this miscalculation extends far beyond Japan. It serves as a reminder that modern wars are not won by bravery alone. They are won by logistics, by industry, by the quiet, unglamorous work of ensuring that every ship, aircraft, and soldier has what they need, every hour, every mile, every day. It is a lesson that echoes across the decades, shaping military doctrine and national strategy even now. So the question remains, what other truths, buried beneath the comfort of assumptions, still wait to be confronted? If you value stories that reveal how history truly unfolds, not through legend, but through the subtle forces behind it, consider joining us. Share your thoughts, your questions, or the lessons you see in this chapter of the past. And above all, thank you for keeping these histories alive. The battles may have ended, but the responsibility to remember them never does.